During this whole process, if there's anything that I have learned, is that what we are being taught is the lesson of duality. It is important to remember that the duality of things is only a manifestation of consciousness because the all, or source, is one. So in understanding this principle, let us take a look at the duality of good and evil. First, for those of you that follow the Bible, you were warned not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Genesis 2:17. But of the tree of knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die. What is really being described in Genesis 2:17 is that man is being warned not to see things as good and evil, or dual in nature. Since the all, or source, is one, when man decided to choose that path, one might interpret the Bible as that his Christ consciousness died. So there's that word again, Christ consciousness. What does that mean? Well, Christ consciousness is defined as a concept of a spiritual transcendence of human consciousness in various traditions of mysticism. Within monotheism, it also refers to the awareness or knowledge of an ultimate reality, sometimes known as God. Alternative terms with similar meanings include superconsciousness, yoga, objective consciousness, Gurdjieff, Buddhic consciousness, theosophy, cosmic consciousness, God consciousness, Sufism and Hinduism, and Christ consciousness. In a secular context, higher consciousness is usually associated with the exceptional control over one's mind and will, and intellectual and moral enlightenment, and profound personal growth. In a spiritual context, it may also be associated with transcendence, spiritual enlightenment, and union with the divine. There are also other verses in the Bible that lead one to believe that the romantic versions and interpretations you were taught in church may not be the correct, and that Christ consciousness interpretation mysteriously aligns with other religious and spiritual teachings. For example, take the following verses from the Bible. Genesis 3:7. Following the consumption of the ideal of good and evil, we heard this. And the eyes of them were both opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. One might interpret the verse as in realizing the duality from good and evil, they experienced cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is discomfort caused by holding conflicting ideas simultaneously. And it was this point, not being in tune with the one, that Christ consciousness died. They surely died. Now back to duality. Let us take a look at the following from the Kabbalion ancient Hermetic philosophy. The Hermetic teaching does not imply a real duality. The all is one. The two aspects are merely aspects of manifestation. The teaching is that the masculine principle, manifested by the all, stands in a way apart from the actual mental creation of the universe. It projects its will towards the feminine principle, which may be called nature, whereupon the latter begins the actual work of the evolution of the universe, from simple centers of activity on to man, and then on, and on still higher, all according to well-established and firmly enforced laws of nature. If you prefer the old figures of thought, you may think of the masculine principle as God, the Father, and the feminine principle as nature, the universal mother from whose womb all things have been born. This is more than a mere poetic figure of speech. It is an idea of the actual process of the creation of the universe. But always remember that the all is but one, and that in its infinite mind the universe is generated, created, and exists. To see this visually, let's take a look at good and evil, where they exist on either pole of an ideal. Remember, at the highest level, since God or source, or the all, is one, good and evil also fit into or inside the one concept. As they are manifestations, either pole can analogously be related to the concept of a negative infinity and a positive infinity, of which pure good and evil is never actually reached, but is an ideal. Therefore, in every case, anything will always fall within the scale between good and evil. Further, one must also apply the concept of perception as well to the principle of good and evil. For example, when two countries go to war, why do both sides pray to God? The answer is because both sides have a different perception of what good is and what evil is. So in conclusion, we can purely see that good and evil are affected by two variables, perception and scale, but all within the manifestation of consciousness from which they are manifested. In other words, one person may see good as something completely different than the other, and to a different degree. For example, the cannibal thinks that eating other humans is perfectly natural, and although you think it's evil, in the end, it's really only a difference in opinion. Where this concept actually begins to really become important is when it is applied to your level of consciousness. Throughout history, man has allowed the church, the government, and other factions to tell them what right from wrong is. And I say, one does not need a book to tell him these things, nor does he need laws written on a piece of paper to tell him what's right from wrong. One does not need a priest or a judge to interpret the language of the heart. Each of you were given this when you came into this world, and remember, all is perception. So, to follow another person's perception of the ideals of good and evil means to be controlled. Here's another passage from the Kabbalian's principle of mental gender. The strong men and women of the world invariably manifest the masculine principle of will, and their strength depends materially upon this fact. Instead of living upon the impressions made by their minds by others, they dominate their own minds by their will, obtaining the kind of mental images desired, and moreover dominate the minds of others likewise in the same manner. Look at the strong people, how they manage to implant their seed thoughts in the mind of the masses of the people, thus causing the latter to think thoughts in accordance with the desires and wills of the strong individuals. This is why the masses of the people are such sheep-like creatures, never originating an idea of their own, nor using their own powers of mental activity. Kabbalion. So, are you ready to hear how you've been controlled for so long? Remember, it's not your fault. You didn't know. It's all part of returning to a Christ consciousness state. For one, the Church has understood the underpinnings of the meaning behind the tree of knowledge of good and evil, or duality, ever since it was written in the book. It is because of this knowledge and their use of the will against minds that were impressionable that they have created a sense of control. Man allowed the Church to define what good was and what evil was, and furthermore told him that because something was evil, he had to stay away from it. In other words, the Church directed you to stay away from the other information contained within the balance of source. Now, knowing that evil is only a manifestation formed from perception and scale of an ideal, then you can see that by not allowing man to perceive a balance of understanding of both good and evil, that your consciousness was at best only half of its potential. In fact, because you were not allowed to look at all of the information, you were never really able to form a frame of reference as to where you stand on your perception of what evil is and what good is. Therefore, with only one side of the equation, you lacked entropy and were thusly controlled. Now let's take a look at government. Government has continually used the idea of duality against you, continually controlling you through measures of divide and conquer. Some examples are race, color, sexual orientation, political views, and class. Using the Republican-Democrat analogy, government has kept you arguing among yourselves all the while they continued their plans, giving you more of the same each time one is chosen into office. And to make the situation worse, they bunch a complete set of separate issues into one bucket and call them, for example, the Republican ticket. or the Democratic ticket. And I would argue that 99% of you find at least one or more issues that you agree to that are on the other ticket. So what is actually created is a sense of cognitive dissonance, and that no matter what ticket you vote, you have to feel bad that some things were not addressed by your party. And finally, one can apply the Fibonacci sequence and the golden mean to the development of consciousness. As we all know, when a seed from a plant begins to grow, it follows the Fibonacci sequence. It's a rough sequence, but one it follows and is born with much like the innate rough concepts of right and wrong you're born with that stem from the heart. You knew in your heart, even as a child, when you did something wrong or you did something that was not right. However, of those things you did not know, you learned through doing them. In other words, you had to experience the dark side before you could understand what the light actually consisted of. This backs up the previously stated concept that without knowledge of the dark, one cannot form the concept of the light. As your consciousness developed and became much more complex around the ideals of what your perception of right and wrong were, you transitioned from a Fibonacci consciousness to a golden mean consciousness. When looking at a graph of the golden ratio, we can see that as the complexity develops, the graph appears to be reaching a state of unity, ultimately losing its duality. So, the moral of the story is, as all experience, both light and dark, are ultimately manifested from Source, it is important to at least gain the knowledge of and information of concepts from all angles that one finally achieves the return to Christ consciousness and lives forever.